good morning, depending on the part of the world in which you are. Thank you very much. And well, before I begin, I would like once again to express my sincere gratitude to Thomas Harrison and Jan Haywood for the welcome invitation, and of course to you all for your time and your patience this evening. The aim of my talk today is to return to a subject, namely Herodotus and Persia, which has been at the center of specialist debate for several decades, from a perspective, however, that I hope will offer some additional food for thought on the tools we have at our disposal to profitably read a complex text such as the histories. In the next minutes, I would like to discuss a passage from the third book, namely 3:117, which seems to me to have received little to or no attention from interpreters in recent years, apart from the now canonical exegesis by Pierre Briand. The appeal of the story narrated by Herodotus is threefold. First, it offers a very specific depiction of Darius, which, my second point, when assessed in the wider context of the work, as has recently been done, provides some clues of considerable interest about an aspect of the moral of the history, as Thomas Harrison said, some years, and discussed by him in a remarkable paper some years ago. Finally, and more importantly, Herodotus 3:117 offers, or so I try to contend, interesting insights into the strategies of territorial control through the policing of the population and his resources, developed by the Persian Empire in an area of its immense territory, namely Chorasmia in Central Asia, which in recent years has been the subject of increasing interest on the part of a growing circle of scholars. As I shall contend, however, such insights can only be exploited if they are provided with an adequate interpretive toolkit. In this case, with an adequate comparanda that allow the episode narrated by Herodotus to be removed from an exclusively textual dimension and placed instead into a historical context. However, unlikely this may seem, but for very precise reasons that I hope to be able to explain at the appropriate time, a bit later on in this talk, I would like to argue today that the story chronicled in the late 30s of Soviet Uzbekistan at the height of Stalinist terror helps to provide the passage I intend to deal with this evening with precisely that historical context, which turns it, so Herodotus' passage, from logos to historia. After having described the circumstances of Darius' accession to the throne and illustrated in some detail the so-called administrative reform of the empire, Herodotus indulges in a long excursus devoted to Chorasmia, a region in the northeast of the empire corresponding roughly to the present-day oasis of Khiva in Uzbekistan. Here, according to the historian, with the aim of securing the obedience of the population and the control of resources, both agricultural and pastoral, since Chorasmia's ties with the world of the steppes were very close and long-lasting, Darius had an impressive system of sluices built, by virtue of which, in Herodotus' words, the water that previously belonged to the locals now belonged to the king, esti to Basileus. The pathetic description of the Chorasmians and their neighbors parading to the Achaemenid court to plead for access to this fundamental resource sanctions in the most iconic way possible the conclusion of the process of conquest initiated by Cyrus and offers a highly effective symbolic representation of the new consolidated Persian power. So you have the text here in the slide. But are we really dealing here only with a symbol? This question and the consequences of how one chooses to answer it will be the focus of my discussion. Out of necessity, it must start for the analysis of the passage proposed by Briand, the only one, as far as I know, who has dedicated himself to the exegesis of this episode. Apart from the rhetorical colores in which the anecdote is presented, and on whose logic Briand does not dwell, the French historian is inclined to take Herodotus' account extremely seriously. In his eyes, it in fact offers a surprisingly accurate representation of the dynamics behind the Persian imperialism, the distinctive feature of which could be summed up as the control of the population through the bureaucratic and administrative apparatus supported by massive infrastructural investments as the dams in Chorasmia reported by Herodotus, and through it of the territory and the resources it generated, which in the case of Central Asia were particularly conspicuous. It should be emphasized that such an exegesis can take advantage of the progress made over the last 10 years in research on the Achaemenid administration, and in particular, the ever-increasing publication of the corpus represented by the Persepolis archives. The main reason for this is that the Persepolis archives allow us to study at an hitherto unprecedented and steadily increasing level of depth the modalities of what Wouter Henkelmann has defined as a process of institutionalization of the subtropic landscape, whose aim consisted, in a word, in the replication appropriately adapted of administrative templates originally developed in order to organize, with the aim, of course, of exploiting the territory of Fars, so the heartland of the empire, to the most diverse geographical and anthropic realities of the immense empire, including, obviously, Central Asia. A point not to be overlooked, archaeological research, and in particular excavations in the Uzbek province of Surkhandarya in the middle of the country, seem to offer further support to Briand and Henkelmann's argument, since it has made possible to document an impressive infrastructural development in the region during the Achaemenid period, not least related to the agricultural sphere and the development of hydraulic engineering projects, for example, millet cultivation in arid or semi-desertic environments, which betray the interest of the imperial administration in the region. On the basis of what has been said so far, the conclusion one would be inclined to draw is that we are faced with yet another case of a text from the Greco-Roman historiographical tradition that can be read against the grain in search of a hardcore of Achaemenid realia. This is in part undoubtedly true, but as I would like to try to illustrate in what remains of my paper, it is not yet the end of the story, and not of the histories, since we are just in book 3. I would like to focus on two aspects in particular. Here you have a map of Uzbekistan and the Surkhandarya region, which has been particularly been the focus of archaeological research, is the one covered in red. And Khwarezm is somehow the territory around this region. To begin with, an interpretation of the passage, such as the one presented so far, and so namely following Briand exegesis, does not, it seems to me, take adequate account of the wider narrative context in which it is set. The term with which, according to Herodotus, by the Persian themselves, Darius is called, namely kapelos, which means huckster, cannot go unnoticed. As Kai Rofing has convincingly argued, in fact, it is a key word for identifying the characteristics of the great Persian king as a dramatist persona within a narrative and ideological discourse that has him contrasted against the background of the trajectory of the empire in itself with his predecessor, for example, Cyrus, a monarch who was ruthless at times, but also just and benevolent, and then Cambyses, a mad tyrant, and with Xerxes, who embodies exasperatingly the defects of all three in the absence of their few virtues. If we add to these considerations, on the basis of Robert Rollinger's studies, that a not insignificant part of Herodotus' intellectual project consists in making shrewd use of traditional topoi of the Near Eastern tradition, for example, Mesopotamian, reframing them, however, in the context both of the narrative plot, in our case, the process of Darius' consolidation of power, and of the wider tapestry of the histories, which we could summarize in terms of a world history seen through the prism of the Persian imperial expansion. The story of the Chorasmians, deprived of access to a resource vital to their survival and reduced to impotent beggars, acquires a level of meaning that is entirely internal, so textual, as I said at the beginning of the paper, to the architecture of Herodotus' work, and consequently cannot merely be used as evidence, however mediated, of a historical phenomenon. I would like to underscore, here are our heroes, so Robert Rollinger and Kai Ruffing. I would like to underscore that with this provisional conclusion, it is not suggested to return to the outdated dichotomy between a Herodotus, who is a collector of historical information that has been more or less deliberately misrepresented, and that it is the historian's task to recover under the narrative cloak on the one hand, and on the other, a narrator of fabulae, as Cicero would say. Rather, a reading of Histories 3:117, which pays due attention to the broader literary context in which it is inserted, allows a privileged access to the laboratory of the histories and to the stories, as Giorgio Proietti said 2 weeks ago, before and next to them, highlighting at the same time the materials at the author's disposal and the architecture, the general framework within which these materials are inserted, and by virtue of which they acquire an additional meaning with respect to the letter of the text and their context of origin. Having come this far, it is worth taking a further step. Both Herodotus' passage and its exegesis by moderns focus exclusively on Darius and, broadly conceived, on the dominant Persian ethno-class dominant. The most recent developments in research of pre-modern empires, of which you have a general overview here, however, have shown very convincingly how the so-called environmental frameworks and the socio-anthropological context, with the editors of these Archaeology of Imperial Landscape, Bleda Düring and Pensestek, could be called the practical situations on the ground, are able to condition, not infrequently in a decisive way, the extraction and control projects characteristic of any imperial apparatus, however articulated and efficient as the Achaemenid empires. In this last section of my paper, the aim is therefore to sketch a model of the practical conditions on the ground underlying the anecdote reported by Herodotus, in order to show how an episode traditionally interpreted as a cogent demonstration of Achaemenid power can at the same time, and without any contradiction, I would like to emphasize this point, be read as an example of what Richard Payne and Ryan King have recently called the limits of the empire, as in the book you saw on the slide previously. And now let's switch time, but not space. Stalinist era Uzbekistan as a comparandum on the basis of which to study a passage from Herodotus may legitimately appear counterintuitive, to say the least. However, as I intended to explain shortly, there are some structural reasons that justify the experiment, among which it is worth noting. First, the environmental, in our case hydrological, constraints imposed on the political and administrative ambitions of the Soviet government, and number two, those of a socio-political nature imposing themselves on a power whose peremptory self-legitimation claims had in reality to reckon with both a rather ephemeral rooting in a relatively recently reconquered territory and, above all, with infrastructural limitations that were by no means negligible. This is a picture, it will be noted, that is surprisingly well suited to late 6th century Central Asia, reclaimed by the now Achaemenid, the former Thespiid empire, at the end of a bloody civil war, the extent of which is evident even between the lines of a text such as that of Pisutun, the famous inscription carved by Darius. And by the way, the fact, as it is shown by the composition of the writing under the visual apparatus of the text of the inscription, that Darius had to recarve almost the entire inscription to account for his victories in Central Asia and on the Scythians. Many of them also dwelled around the area which is the topic of this paper, provides quite a meaningful blueprint of the importance of reconquest of Central Asia by Darius. So it means that we have to deal with the situation he found at the end of the Civil War. An indispensable prelude to the anecdote that I intend to use as a touchstone on which to make deeper sense, I hope, of the hydraulic history of the Chorasmians is that the Amu Darya, one of the two great Central Asian water sources and a crucial asset for local agriculture and urbanism, even today, is a river with an extremely complex regime, the management of which has for centuries constituted a compelling challenge for any political entity that has ever sought to exploit the territories through which it flows. If you want some account of these attempts, those two books you see in the slide are really compelling narratives. Faizullah Khojayev, a prominent member of the Uzbek Communist Party and a scion of an important family of the Bukharan intelligentsia, was very well aware of that. In 1938, he found himself entrusted by no other than Stalin with the unrewarding task of devising a system to prevent the cyclical flooding of the river in order to save the cotton harvests on which Moscow economic planning had relied heavily in the framework of the industrialization project, one, of the Uzbek Republic, and two, more generally, on the entire Union. There is no need to insist too much on the far from relaxed nature of the political climate of the time. Instead, it is worth emphasizing, one, that the best engineers brought to Chorasmia directly from Moscow in an attempt to regulate the waters of the Amu Darya has so far failed dramatically, and number two, that the project itself, which is a distinctly imperial undertaking to be compared with Darius' sluices, offered the new Uzbek ruling class an instrument of extraordinary power to pursue internal political competition, so the practical situations on the ground, by other means. Which means making use of the apparatus that the empire now provided, and not just as single power holders running war against one another. In an attempt to extricate himself and, what is decisive for my discussion, determined to exploit to his own and his faction's advantage the political and social capital made available to him anything but for free by Soviet imperial power, Khojayev did not hesitate for a second to relieve the teams of engineers recruited for the best polytechnics in the entire Union of their duties, recruiting instead by making extensive use of the strategical help provided by members of his own clientele, which was indeed very well ramified, and is only fitting any satrapal households, ancient and modern, a handful of local experts, from shepherds to village chiefs and semi-settled farmers. Contrary to all expectations, perhaps including those of Faizullah Abdullayevich himself, the flood was indeed averted. In different times, such an outcome would have allowed Khojayev to get rid of all his opponents, of whom there were quite a lot, within the party, while at the same time ensuring huge dividends in terms of, again, local power for the members of his faction, whose ecological skills what James Scott has called metic skills, so the local knowledge that imperial elites and the imperial apparatus do not have, and they are rooted in the habits of local population, had proved to be indispensable for the protection of a strategic asset such as Uzbek cotton. Moral of the story: in the light of such an account, it does not seem, I hope at least, entirely out of place to reread Herodotus 3:117 through the lens of Hojayev hydraulic exploit. The Persian Kratos mentioned by Herodotus in the region should accordingly be interpreted as the outcome of a negotiation with the representatives of the local communities who alone, one, possessed the knowledge and, as mentioned, by no means trivial skills necessary to profit economically, or at least to avoid a cataclysm, from a river such as the Amu Darya, and, number two, were the only ones able to find and mobilize, because you don't have just to find them, then you have to put them at work, the necessary labor force which from time to time was needed in order to carry out the tasks the empire needed in order to satisfy its ever-increasing demands. The real owners and controllers of what Bourrienne called the modes and the means of production, from this point of view, would therefore not be the imperial officials, to say nothing of Darius far away in Persepolis or whatever, but the Chorasmian elites and the members of their households. As for Darius, my suggestion is to argue that in exchange of the accessibility of that stretch of river flowing through Chorasmia, which he wanted to control, he transformed into imperial managers the more fortunate predecessor of Hojayev. For the latter, before the advent of the Achaemenid power, were nothing more than modest and probably regularly competing among themselves local big men, which is a situation, by the way, which you can easily see through the lens of the Alexander historians, as Alexander fought his way through exactly that region in between 329 and 327, has been described in one recent article by Claude Rapin, which I think I enlisted in the bibliography. The most obvious strength of such an interpretation of Herodotus' account is that, without doing violence to the text, it offers a picture of the mechanisms underlying the functioning of especially, but by no means only, infrastructural imperial power, which within a pre-modern context, which is consistently in line with the most recent currents of historical research on a space such as Central Asia. In addition, such an assessment, it is also consistent, as I already mentioned, with similar hypotheses put forward recently by other scholars, again, most notably Claude Rapin, regarding a comparable context in Achaemenid ruled Central Asia, in which the exploitation of a watery resource may have been the precondition for the role that, at least according to historiographic sources, an individual like Arimazes, one of the lords of these fortresses Alexander conquered, seems to have been capable of playing in a key territory such as the upper Surkhandarya Valley around the Derbent Pass in modern-day Uzbekistan, exactly in the middle of the country, a crucial bottleneck to connect Baktra in Afghanistan to Samarkand in Uzbekistan, which were the two main seats, as far as we can judge, of Achaemenid power in northern Central Asia. Finally, and arguably most importantly for the overall logic of the case which has been made so far, such hypothesis allows us to rethink the power relations between two groups whom we may call, following the title of a recently published book on exactly those very same topics within a colonial framework, masters and natives, giving moreover a higher level of agency to social actors others than the great king and the satraps, which on the contrary, also of course because of the nature of the available ancient evidence, have been the almost exclusive focus of more or less recent historiography on Achaemenid Central Asia. I'm coming to the conclusions. By interpreting an Herodotian account, which has traditionally been taken as reflecting, at least to some extent, the dynamics underlying Achaemenid strategies of control and exploitation of the conquered Central Asians lands, as well as of their resources against the background of an admittedly very specific sample of ethnographic evidence, the main goal of this paper has been to elucidate by what means some new light can be shed both on the ways in which imperial governmentality worked and on the responses to its implementation coming from the people the great king claimed to have conquered. You know, at the end of almost every passage in the Byzantine inscription, King Darius said, that land became mine. How it became his, it's interesting to further inquire. This assessment of Herodotus 397 nicely supports Robert Rollinger's claim that Herodotus' narrative always demands to be read from different perspective angles, for in his text, what is being said, in our case, for example, what Darius did, is as important as what it is omitted, namely with whom actually the emperor had to deal in order to control the Amudarya. Again, the practical situations on the ground. This is true both in the case of the most famous passages of the histories, such as Darius' accession to the throne, and in that of the apparently more anonymous ones, like the one discussed here, accounting for the troubles of an allegedly powerless ethnos at the northeastern borders of the Persian realm. Thank you very much for your patience, your time, and of course, your attention.